Next thing is to give details, examples, and reasons. Why is this important? In your speaking part 3, which is the discussion part, the questions that you will be given are questions that usually will tax your brain more than what you've been given in your part 1 or your part 2. In line with our tip not to give short monosyllabic answers to your questions in the IELTS, you want to expand them. And the easiest ways to expand your answers in the IELTS will be what? Giving examples, giving reasons, or sharing personal experiences to expand. But for the part 3, you do not want to rely too much on personal experiences, as the part 3 questions are actually more of opinion questions, but they are opinion questions at a much more general level than the part 1 questions. So for example, a question in part 1 could be, do you like football or do you like sports? In part 3, that question would now be changed to, why do people like sports? Do people in your country like sports? That question cannot be answered by saying, personally, I like sports. If you say, personally, I like sports, you have changed the direction of the question. If you are, or if you must use your personal perspective to answer the question, always find a way to still link it to the general opinion. So, personally, I like sports, and I believe a lot of people in my country reason the way that I do. So I would say, yes, most people in my country like sports. That way, I have been able to take my personal experience and link it to what people to a much more general population, what they think about sports, instead of just sticking to just my own personal experience. Remember, in the speaking part 3, you need to be as vocal, you need to produce as much information as possible if you want to get that desired score. Next is for you to stick to the topic. Please, as much as possible, because the questions in your part 3 might be technical, might be difficult, might be disturbing. A lot of people tend to veer off the topic. Please do not veer off topic. If you do not understand, or if you're not clear about what you want to talk about, ask for clarification before you answer. Do not just jump into a question because you feel ashamed asking for clarification, or you do not want the examiner to think that you do not understand English language. Ask for clarification. It is better to ask for clarification and be cleared on what you want to say than to just jump into an answer and give a very beautiful speech that says nothing. Next, you should also think that you will do well. This is a psychological tip. Thinking that you will do well obviously will translate into you doing well. But if you start the exam with this panic, or you start the exam with this self-loathing or self-hate, thinking already, defeating yourself that you will not do well, chances are that no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how prepared you are, you still will not do well. So psychologically, prepare yourself for the speaking part 3 and engage in that mental prep where you tell yourself that I'm going to be talking about so thing that I talked about in part 2, and here I will do this, and I will try as much as possible to put my best foot forward and give a good showing of myself, or give a good account of my communicative prowess. Next thing is to build vocabulary beforehand. And I told you earlier how to build vocabulary beforehand for your part 3. This is what, by looking at the question that you're given in part 2, in between the time where the examiner stops your part 2 talk, your part 2, the section 2 of the speaking of the IELTS, and you move to part 3, you should, as much as possible, start playing around with different vocabulary items that relate to the particular topic that you have been asked in your part 2. Also, relate the question to your own life. I also gave a tip earlier too, that if you're going to use your personal experience or you're going to relate it to your own life, as much as possible, do not forget to also connect it to a general perspective. Please, you do not want to just use your own personal experiences alone to answer questions in your section 3 in the IELTS. And finally, you should also divide up your answers. Divide up your answers. What do I mean by dividing up your answers? This is where I told you that even if you're going to use personal experiences, ensure that you still bring in the general perspective. That is dividing your answers. So you know that every time you're giving a question in your part 3, you will use a personal experience and also relate it to a general perspective. That is already 2 divisions for your answers. As much as possible, stick to this format, and this will assure you of the desired score that you want in the IELTS, which is most predictably your band 9 or your band 8.5. And finally, use modals. What are modal verbs? Modal verbs are helping verbs. They are also called auxiliary verbs that help nouns or that help verbs to convey or express nuances in the action performed in a sentence or in a context. There are words like can, could, would, will, may, might, should, shall, ought to, and must to. Now, please, you must as much as possible, you should as much as possible know how to use these modals or use these auxiliary verbs correctly. They convey different shades of meaning, and knowing the different shades of meaning that they convey will help you significantly in the test. And why is it important to use modals? Most times in your part 3, you will be asked questions that require you to give absolute answers. And you should know that it is the mark of a good communicator not to put themselves in a position where they have to give absolute answers that do not leave room for exceptions. So, for example, if the question says that, do you think that ebooks will completely replace paperback books in the future? Of course, you do not, an answer that says that, yes, I think they will completely replace paperback books in the future is not such a good answer, because we do know that there are no absolutes in life and there are always exceptions to every rule. So a perfect answer to that question could be that while ebooks are gaining prominence nowadays, there is a very likely chance that they will still coexist with paperback books in the future, as paperback books will never go out of circulation because some people will still love them and they may not be able to even read a book without holding it in their hands or having a physical feel of what you're reading. This ensures that while paperback books might reduce in popularity, they will always still coexist with ebooks even in the future, even if it's 1,000 years in the future. Finally, also to learn how to express your opinion. Learn opinion expressions. Opinion expressions from my own point of view, from where I stand, from my stand, in my own opinion. Personally, I think, I believe, I know, I would assume. Knowing all these expressions that indicate opinion are very, very important ways for you to get good scores in the IELTS. Lastly, when you are answering a question that you do not have so much in-depth knowledge about, it is okay to let the examiner know that you are answering from a weak point. So, for example, do you think museums should be paid businesses, or should they be run as a public service? For example, now, I've never been to a museum, I do not know much about museums, and I'm supposed to answer that question. I will start my answer by saying that that's an interesting question. While I do not know much about museums, I do know that museums are places where historical artifacts are kept, and learning history is important in determining the future. So I would think that since learning history is so important, it should be something that should be free for everyone to access. That way, I think museums should be public service much more than a paid business venture. That way, I have started from the beginning, indicating to the examiner that I do not have so much idea about museums, and I also use the word assume, which shows that I am working from a very weak stand and it is just an assumption. But I have also been able to convey what I feel, and the most important thing in IELTS is how you express yourself, not what you are expressing itself. The content is not as important as the medium of expression. So you want to put a lot of focus on the medium of expression much more than the content of what you were saying, which is why I would stress again, it is a test of communication, not a test of intelligence. So what are the things that you should not do? The don'ts for the speaking part 3. Do not memorize answers. I've said this before, I would say it again, and it is very, very relevant irrespective of whatever section that you are dealing with in the IELTS. Do not memorize answers. Do not worry if you make mistakes. Do not worry if you make mistakes. Do not worry if you make mistakes. This is a very, very important tip that a lot of people disregard or they cannot use effectively. You're talking. in your sentence that contains 10 words, you make a mistake in the third word and then you break down and you stop. I've seen people go and they're saying things like, I went to go, do not do that. When you do that, you're already assessing yourself. It is the job of the examiner to assess your communicative competence. It is not your job to assess your mistakes. If you make a mistake and you can identify that you've made a mistake, take a pause and correct it. If you cannot correct it or you cannot identify that you made a mistake, please put on your strong face and move on and just roll through that question, roll through that sentence and continue. If you are talking and you get stuck looking for a particular word or vocabulary item, please stop that sentence and pick up a new thread of thought and continue with that. Do not allow vocabulary items to keep you stuck, and do not allow mistakes to drop or truncate your flow in the speaking test. Do not use too many ums, ahs, and speech fillers. We call them speech fillers because they are meant to just fill in the blank spaces in your utterances. A lot of us here in Africa use speech fillers a lot, and we consider them a sign of wealth or a sign of affluence. But in the speaking part of the IELTS, it will fail you. So, consciously reduce the number of speech fillers that you use in the IELTS, as it will not only reduce the quality of your answers, it will also make you less audible and it will also affect your fluency. Do not use too many speech fillers. A lot of us also do not consider some things that are speech fillers to be speech fillers. Things like, it's like, you know. These are speech fillers that are very common in the part of the world that I come from. And these are things that you must avoid when you are taking the speaking test in the IELTS. You should also avoid using things like I think. Remember, in the speaking part 3, although it's an opinion question, they are still looking at it from a general perspective. And if you keep on using words like I think, you're only going to be answering those questions based on your personal experience or your personal opinion. You also want to broaden the scope of your opinion and make it seem as if this is a general opinion or this is much of a general thing than just something that you personally or individually subscribe to. Also, there's a very easy tip that a lot of people use when they are stuck with questions. So you are asked a question and you do not know what to say. You're completely clueless about it. Instead of just pausing and just freezing and just getting stuck without saying anything, a lot of people use this. They call it like a stopgap before they start answering. They say things like, that's an interesting question, or they say things like, that's an amazing question, or they say things like, that's a good question. Well, this is actually a very good ploy or a good strategy to keep you from being stuck when you don't know what to say. You do not want to overdo it. If you're given 8 questions in your speaking part 3 and 7 out of 8 questions you start with, that's a good question, that's a good question, that's a good question. The next thing the examiner is going to be wondering is there ever a bad question? You do not want to do this. So, as much as possible, balance your need to use speech fillers, balance your need to use all those tips, all those, I'll call them conversation crutches that you can lean on when you are falling. Balance your need to use them with your need to give a very robust and clearly communicative experience in your speaking test. Also, you also should not worry if you have an accent. I've said this before and I'll repeat it again. Your accent, although shouldn't be so horrible or atrocious that you become unintelligible, you should not bother yourself too much about your accent, because it has taken you years and years to build that accent and you're not going to discard it in the 1 month or couple of weeks that you're preparing for the IELTS. Finally, do not worry if you make mistakes. Mistakes are a common aspect of communication. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm very sure that in the course of this video, I've made like a couple of mistakes that you will probably pause and just laugh and say, he's our speaking examiner, or he's our IELTS tutor, and he's making this kind of mistakes. Mistakes are an essential part of communication, as no one is above making mistakes. What you want to do is to pick yourself up after you make a mistake, correct it if you know the correct form. If you do not know the correct form, continue your conversation and do not allow it to affect your utterances. Finally, prepare. There's no substitute for preparation and practice. The speaking test, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, is one of the easiest aspects in the IELTS to prepare for, with the use of modern technology like phones, which have voice recorders that you can record your answers. You can play it out for your tutor later on, or you can even play it out for your accountability partner, who could be a friend or your spouse, or you can even listen to it yourself to see how you sound and improve on the areas that you do not like your expressions. Finally, I wish you all the best in the IELTS, and I can assure you that if you use this video religiously and you practice these tips diligently, you will achieve that desired score, which is a band 9 in the IELTS.